Welcome. My name's Alex Whiting. I know many of you because I required you to be here. But they're happy to be here. I'm a professor of practice here at the law school. This is a very exciting event. We have 7 district attorneys here. You should have gotten their bios, but I think some of them are being passed around if you didn't get them. We'll make sure that you get them, because if I went through their bios, we'd reach the end of the event without any questions. We're going to go till 6 o'clock, and then there will be a reception afterwards outside where you have a chance to speak individually to all the prosecutors. And I don't know if they'll be offering jobs, but that may be part of the program. The session is being recorded, so if you speak, you consent to being recorded. We're going to start with Miriam Krinsky, who's the Executive Director of the Fair and Just Prosecution Project, who is co-sponsoring this event with us, the Criminal Justice Policy Program here at the Harvard Law School. So I'm going to let her make a few opening remarks. Then I'm going to ask questions, and I've encouraged the prosecutors to jump in, to talk, sort of respond to one another. I will leave time for questions at the end, so if you have questions, be ready, and we'll have some conversation at the end. So, Miriam.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll stand. So, can you all hear me, or better with the mic? The mic. Okay. The guy in the back is saying, like, yeah, hold the mic up. So thank you, and it's great to be here, and great to see the interest. Just out of curiosity, how many of you think you might want to be prosecutors? Oh, wow. Wow. So, and actually, how many of you think you might want to be public defenders?
It's okay.
Yay, okay. How many of you want to be tax lawyers? Anybody care to admit that? Maritime? No maritime in the mix. Any of you think you might want to be civil rights lawyers? Great. So we're going to be talking a little bit later about, and I want to give you a sense of sort of my pathway here, and I know that these folks will as well, about a new program that we're launching called the Fair and Just Prosecution Fellows Program. And we are looking for those of you, it's okay if you want to be a prosecutor, but for those of you who want to be public defenders, want to be civil rights lawyers, we want to see you spend your summer in a prosecutor's office and help to bring about new thinking and change from within. And it's not to say, again, that those of you who already want to be prosecutors are automatically off the table, but our aim, and again, I'll talk in a minute about fair and just prosecution, is really to start to bring about some changes in paradigms in prosecutors' offices. So I spent a decade and a half as a prosecutor. I was an assistant U.S. attorney with a large office, 2 metropolitan areas, Los Angeles and the D.C. suburbs. I prosecuted during the escalating tough on crime years of the 80s, 90s into 2002. I prosecuted before and after the sentencing guidelines. I prosecuted as mandatory minimums were getting passed quicker than you could think about the next crime that might warrant a mandatory minimum. And I served for the last around 10 years of that as a supervisor in my office. So I saw not just my caseload, but the caseload of over 200 prosecutors that I supervised. And what I started to see over those years were just patterns that became incredibly disheartening. More and more young people coming into the justice system, less and less ability to look at the individual rather than sort of figuring out a formula that applied to them. Fewer opportunities to seize a window of opportunity where we could really make a difference in that person's life and try to put them on a better pathway. More and more families being broken up. More and more, especially young men of color, coming into the justice system, and our prisons growing larger and larger. And at the end of the day, my view was, not only weren't we doing the right thing for the individual, but we weren't doing the right thing for our community. We weren't making our communities that much safer or safer at all. And so I left to do what few people had left the U.S. Attorney's Office to do, but to run an organization that represented children and young people. a legal services group that represented over 20,000 kids in the child welfare and juvenile justice system. And again, saw some patterns that weren't particularly heartening in terms of how we treat and what pathway we put young people on that all of us undertake as a community to parent and to do better. It is with great joy that I'm returning to the field of prosecution to work with a group like the individuals you're going to hear from today. Because I believe in fair and just prosecution, and there are some terrific people from our team here believe that we are at an incredible beginning of a moment in the field of prosecution. Last November saw prosecutors elected who ran on agendas that were very different. It was about right-sizing the justice system. It was about emphasizing engagement in the community and strategies around prevention. It was about engaging with young people and trying to help young people find different pathways. It was about thinking about issues like bail reform, like how do we not have a justice system where poverty is a driver, like how do we think about different approaches to not criminalizing those who are struggling with mental illness or drug addiction. And this is the kind of group that we're working with. They're different. Many of them broke through glass ceilings. And fair and just prosecution tries to work with them to help them succeed in this very difficult challenge that they've undertaken. So we work with them directly, and we work with them through a network that we've patched together of prosecutors who think about these issues in the same way and in a way that's different than it used to be thought about in the past. Prosecutors tend to too often fall below the radar, and too often when they're elected, they have the job for life. Not that I don't want these guys to have it for life.
Of course not.
Of course not, Mark, yeah. But too many prosecutors never even have somebody take them on at the time of their election. Over 95% are reelected, over 85% don't even have a challenger. So again, it's not that we believe that these should all be contested elections, but it's a healthy thing for us to engage in a conversation around who are prosecutors, why is their job so important, and why does our community need to better understand the job that they do? Why do we need for them to hold each other accountable and to bring about changes within their office? So we are thrilled to see this conversation happening today. I'm going to be talking at the end about the FJP Fellows Program and the 3 law schools, Harvard among them, that we're partnering with to look for fellows to work in their offices. So if you like what you hear, we are trying to create opportunities where our fellows will be networked together and we'll work on policy projects with them and with our network as well. So more to come on that, but most importantly, thank you for setting the stage for this.
Thank you, Miriam. Now, Miriam has said a few words about this group of prosecutors. Just so you know, 2 of the prosecutors, Christian Gossett and Tori Verber Salazar, have been in office for a number of years. The remaining prosecutors are new to the job and have come with they've been in the job for about a year or even less, and they've come with new reform ideas. All of them have reform ideas. Some are new and some have experience. Many of them have long experiences as prosecutors before they became DAs. First question goes to Mark. Mark, you became the prosecutor, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce Wyandotte?
You got it right.
Wyandotte County,
Wyandotte
in Kansas in January. And earlier today, you said that since you became prosecutor, you've been overturning and flipping cabinets and making changes. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to becoming prosecutor? Because you're a minister, you were a defense lawyer, now you're the DA. And then also talk about some of the changes that you have started to implement.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity for allowing us to be here and to speak. I'll start off with, as Professor stated, I am a minister, and so you got to tell me if I'm talking too much or just say amen. I grew up in Wyandotte County, which is an inner city in Kansas City, Kansas there, and it was a high crime rate. At the age of 8 years old, I found my first dead body from a drive-by shooting. By the age of 12, I ran while someone else shot and killed someone that was standing beside me. So by the age of 12, I had seen 2 violent crimes in my day. And so my father and mom taught us, look, son, all you can do right now is pray. And so I made it my business to make sure I prayed for my community and Lord help. Well, then I found out that education can change things. I had an opportunity to meet at the age of 14 my first lawyer. I had never met a lawyer, had never seen a lawyer. At 14, I shadowed a judge, a little short black guy with an afro, and I walked in and they said, all rise, and it blew my mind because I had never seen one before, let alone one that looked like me. And so that changed in my mind the entire trajectory of where I wanted to go and what I was able to do. From there, it turned into a 7-year mentor-mentee relationship. I ultimately became a lawyer. I started out as a clerk, went on to become a prosecutor in Kansas City, Missouri, on the Missouri side, then was a public defender for 3 years, handling all sorts of high-level felony cases. And then the last 4 years was working for my wife, who was my law partner. She does family law, and she hired me to do criminal defense work. We're still married, and so I think I did okay. And so what encouraged me to run in this arena was really that mentor-mentee relationship. I learned early on in law school that it was the chief prosecutor in town who had the most power, who had the most discretionary authority. And though as a defense lawyer, I had the ability to defend the Constitution and make sure that I'm fighting for the rights of one person. However, as the district attorney, it was my job to make sure that the gate was closed to injustice. And so then I thought about, well, let's look at who are the chief law enforcement officers. And in my county, it was a fellow who was there for 12 years as the head DA, and for 22 years before that as the assistant to the guy who was there with him for 32 years as the head DA. Hence meaning for 50 years, hard on crime was a mantra, and everybody knew it. If you got arrested, you wasn't getting justice and you was going to jail. And so my thought process was, if I can get in that seat, then I can actually not just pray, but I can affect change and try to lower the crime rate by actually filing charges on Lil Ray Ray and Pookie that the past administration was let them kill each other and we just stay out of the way. Well, since I grew up in that area, I knew that that didn't work. Right? And so Ray Ray was killing and we wasn't charging, then he would come back to the block and kill some more. And so I ran against him, and a lot of prayer and God saying yes and the voter saying yes. I beat him out, and now I'm in there, and that goes to flipping the cabinets, dealing with a lot of lawyers and a lot of judges who have been there for years and who are looking at this thought process that I picked up from now Senator Harris on this smart on crime, this smart prosecution, and looking at how we are actually dealing with criminals rather than simply punishing them and locking them up, because you can't lock everyone up for the rest of their lives. They're going to get out. And when they get out, what are they going to do? And so my focus has been on really seeing, okay, what diversions are we doing? What crimes are we prosecuting? And what crimes have we not, or rather have failed to prosecute in the last decade because of the thought process, let those in the high crime area kill each other off. And that has been a refreshing thought process for the community. The community has come on board because they're seeing Lil Ray Ray picked up and actually stay in jail. Now, it comes with some issues because now I got to get the witness in there to testify against them. But those are many of the challenges that we're dealing with to show that we actually care about the entire community. And the last thing that we're doing is, before I ran, it was only about 15 to 20% of our community that actually knew what the district attorney's office did, period. nobody knew what we did. Everyone was mad at the police, but did not know who was actually the force behind it. Well, now, all of my attorneys, all of my assistants in my office, it is mandatory that we go into the community, that we go to the neighborhood watches, that we go to the schools to train, to teach, to speak, so that everyone can know what it is that we do, so that we can build a community that is educated, so that we can be held accountable for the authority and the discretionary use of the powers that we have.
Wow, that's super interesting. I'm struck by your attention to both over prosecution but under prosecution at the same time, and in trying to address both things, trying to think about how prisoners are being treated and also thinking about your relationship with the community. I'll be interested in what the other prosecutors, how they relate to those points. I'm going to turn to Tori Verber Salazar, who's been the DA in San Joaquin, I did that right? County in California since 2014. And so you've had an opportunity. Mark is just fresh into the job. You hear some of what he's trying to do. You've been in the job for a number of years, and I know that you have tried to make a number of changes. Can you talk about what you've been able to do and maybe what you haven't been able to do? What are some of the limits on change?
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for having us today. We're greatly honored to be here, and it's great and it's inspiring to see all of you. I came into office in 2015. I was the first woman to ever be elected into the position of San Joaquin County District Attorney. And prior to that, I worked for an administration that hadn't promoted a woman in over 30 years, or a person of color. I think we had one individual in that time. So my office was in bad shape, to say the least. We were still doing everything the exact same way we did when I walked in the door in 1987 as a 21-year-old thinking about going to law school. So nothing had changed during the 25-plus years I had been there in the way that we looked at the community and approached the community. 10 years prior to that, and I highly recommend all of you do this, is you go work in a prison. It'll change your life. Because so often what you do in cases as a prosecutor, you only see what's in front of you, and you have a stack of files, and it could be 100 deep, and you don't even know if it was a man or a woman that stood up there and took the plea on this case because you're handling them so fast. You became a court process server. You just process these cases and get through it. So spending time in a program that I do that I've beyond incarceration since probably the 90s really opened my eyes to stop and slow down and look at everybody as an individual. And I think in this system, whether you be in criminal or civil, you have so many cases and you're doing so much so quickly that you don't stop and personalize and ask yourself, what's happening on the other side here? What's going on? And what's really our end game? So is it better for the community just to lock everybody up and throw away the key? Well, in some circumstances, maybe. Maybe. That's hard to hear, but there are people out there that are murdering and raping children, and maybe they need that time away from society where they no longer can inflict harm. But that's a very small percentage of the cases that we do every day. The vast majority are low to mid-level cases. So how do we deal with that? How do we look at those cases? And even how do we look at those who commit the most egregious acts against people in our community? So taking that time to stop and look, whether it be from how did this arrest occur? Why is this arrest occurring? Why is it disproportionate that more men and women of color are arrested than Caucasian counterparts? Why is it that DA's office mostly reflect white men and aren't as diverse as their community? Why is that? Why is it that when we're in the court, more fines and fees and bails are being set against certain identifiable groups than not? Why? You have to keep challenging yourself, and the list can go on and on and on. Why are jails not places where reform's going on instead of purely punitive or punishment? And the same goes for prison. Because if 90+% of your population is coming back out, why are we not making them better when they come back out? Because otherwise you're just guaranteeing they're going to be repeat offenders. And that's what we have in California. We have 70% recidivism rate. So we looked at and challenged ourselves across the board. How are we going to make systematic change? Change is very difficult. Very difficult, especially when you have career prosecutors, because that change is asking them to change who they are, what they are, and what they've believed, and how they've defined themselves. When you go to work, you define yourself by the success of your work, and if you don't really stop and evaluate it, you're going to think you're naturally successful. We didn't have data. We were very data-driven. We still are data-driven, and that is across the United States. We do not have good data on what occurs in prosecutors' offices. So we had to stop and slow down and figure out a way to do that and finance it. We're still working on that. And then we had to say, what are we doing here? Why are people having so much contact with the criminal justice system, and are we making them better? No. So that's when we decided to create change, when we had that tough conversation. Homeless, mental health, and addiction are not crimes. They're issues that we need to face as a society, but we've become a society which is codependent, if you will, on law enforcement to go and arrest them. To what? Put them in a system that doesn't make them better, makes them worse. So that system had to stop. So we had to look at those. And some of the programs that we're doing in that area are Law Enforcement Arrest Deferral Program, which is out of Seattle, headed up by Dan Setterberg. And that allows law enforcement to divert people immediately out of the system. So they don't come into the criminal justice system, but they go to case management and they receive the wraparound services. So if they're struggling with addiction or mental health or homelessness or all of the above, they're going to be attached to a case manager that can facilitate them into those resources, get them back on their feet. We also have an attorney that will be assigned to them, and that attorney will start to clean up their record. A lot of people have old outstanding bench warrants and things like that. We're cleaning those up for them so that we can get them back up on their feet, back up in society, to whatever level that may be, and performing at that level. We also did the SAFE Stockton Alliance for Equity, and I'm in partnership with the public defender, the chief of police, the sheriff, and the head of the courts. And we work to make things equitable for the mistakes that we made. Because as prosecutors, we need to be telling everybody that we apologize for the discriminatory practices that we did. We allowed people to be prosecuted solely based on their race, their gender, their socioeconomics, their demographics, whatever the case may occur. We played a role in that. And as a DA, a court, or a judge, defense attorney, civil, whatever you are the guardians of the greatest documents of all time, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights when it comes to people. These are great documents that have to be protected. And when we're in court and we fail to protect those, when we failed to stand up, when we failed to bring attention to the fact that they were not being properly administered or being administered in a discriminatory manner or practice, we failed society as a whole. So we now go out and we publicly apologize for the role that we played in the discriminatory practices in the criminal justice system, and now we try to build to make equity in our community. And by doing that, we're releasing old warrants from 2008 to 2014 for low-level offenders. We're getting rid of those. We're working with our community-based organizations to assist those who are currently incarcerated and coming back into reentry. We're also reaching out to our youth to empower them with the decisions to make the right decisions. We defer 70 to 80% of our juveniles out of the system. We don't even charge them. And we did a pilot program called the Navigator to get that last 10 to 15% out of the system. We don't even want you coming in. We want you to stay out there, be healthy and happy and productive, because it keeps our society whole. And then it allows us to focus on those who are really, intent is to commit harm on our community, and allows us to target our resources in a better way. So those are just a few of the things we're doing.
Just a few. Tori, you picked up on a theme that Mark introduced, which is engagement with the community and connecting to the community. And I wonder, and you talk about apologizing for past practices. One of the kind of truisms that we often think about with DAs is that you are beholden to the law and order crowd, and that you don't have a lot of maneuverability because the people who vote want law and order. That's what the media plays up and so forth. And so the politics push you to that position. But it sounds like you've been able to resist that.
Yes and no. I ran on a Tough on Crime platform. I was elected in 15, and so my community is, especially Stockton, California, is a high crime rate community. It's usually in the top 5, sometimes in the United States, for crime. I have about 40% living below the poverty level. Truancy rate hovering and dropout rate somewhere at a high of 44%. So we had a serious situations going on in our community that were leading to a lot of this stuff that was just being very destructive. So we had to look at the totality of it all and look at every component of it and figure out ways to get people back in. So our part with the community is we're everywhere in the community. There's never a night. I don't think any of these, I always say I don't think my kids could pick me out of a photo lineup, but we're out every night. We go every weekend. We talk to every organization, and we work with them on collaboration. We want them to partner with us under public safety. And it's important that we talk about that, because the conversations so often were kind of a knee-jerk reaction. Let's go back to our safety, to our blanket, our favorite blanket, and say, oh, put them in prison. and that works. Statistically, data-driven, best evidence practice, all of that terminology you want to throw in there, overwhelmingly shows you it doesn't work. It does not work. And so what are we going to do, and how are we going to do that, and how are we going to change and create that kind of change? So we had to start having those conversations. So these past 2 years since I've been elected, I do have those conversations. I go out and I talk to people, and I tell them whether it's morally, if you're not inclined to do it, then do it for the economics. Because the economics are crazy, because it's so much money and resources. It costs $65,000 to $95,000 in California to house an individual. Higher if there's more special needs. It'll cost you about $2,500 a pop per arrest by the time you get it to the courts, to the DA, to the public defender. And that's if they come in and plead from the get-go. If it goes to trial on a misdemeanor, it can run me about $10,000. If it's a felony, it can run about $25,000 to about $250,000, depending on the complex nature of the case and the experts that we have to bring in. So you're looking at spending all this money and resource to prove that an individual committed a crime and then to house them. But during the course of it, we never stopped and said, what's wrong? What's really wrong here? And I'll give you a prime example. We had an arsonist he had set fires to an abandoned building. And then when we arrived, he was screaming at the building, demanding people come out. It was clearly abandoned. So we put him in. His attorney immediately declared him not competent to proceed in 1368 proceeding. And we sent him to a facility, a live-in facility that cost us 8 months to spend almost $100,000 for him to become competent, which is just two things: to understand the nature of the charges against you and to assist your counsel. That's it. So we spent $100,000, and he came back at 8 months. Well, he's already credit for time served because his exposure was 16, so we let him back out. We never once asked, why are you setting fires? So we didn't make him better. We didn't make my society safer. We didn't make the public safer. We didn't do anything but spend a lot of money and resources on trying to get to a legal technical standpoint, but never asked the simple questions. I would have rather spent the $100,000 on finding out why something has happened to this individual that's put him in this position, and we need to address that and fix that. Otherwise, he's already back. And so those are kind of things where you really have to stop and look at the system, look at the individuals, and tackle each case from that perspective, and not a blanket policy of this is the low, this is the high, and that's it.
So that picks up on another theme of Mark's, which is smart on crime. Eric, you are the acting district attorney in Brooklyn. You've been in that position for the last year. You are now running unopposed to become the district attorney. When is the election for any New York voters here?
November.
Okay, it's in November. You have had a long career in the district attorney's office in Brooklyn. Can you talk about first your path to that office and where you grew up in New York and what you were exposed to in that journey, and then also how have you seen the role and conception of the prosecutor change in the last 10, 15, 20 years?
So my journey was a little bit like Mark's. I grew up in the toughest neighborhood in New York City in the 80s. I grew up in East New York, a section of Brooklyn, which was called the homicide capital of New York City. My precinct where I lived had more homicides in it than most cities have in the course of a year. And I happened to live in East New York during the very start of the crack cocaine epidemic. So I grew up in a community where the threat of violence was real and existed each and every day. I wanted to make my community better. My family's from Puerto Rico, but I was born in Brooklyn. And I didn't know any attorneys, but I was committed to trying to make my neighborhood safer. And so I joined the DA's office after graduating law school for the purpose of making sure that my community was a better place. But once I was there, I realized that I viewed the world a little bit differently than a lot of other prosecutors who came into the job because they wanted to get litigation skills or they wanted to learn how to try a case. I came because I actually cared about my community. And having grown up in East New York, I saw not only the issue of crime, but I did see the sense and experience the sense of being over-policed, but underserved at the same time, not feeling that the law enforcement community had the best interest of the residents of my community at heart. So I made a decision to stick it out in the DA's office. I thought about being a public defender, but I believe that if I played the long game, and it really is a long game, it was over 20 years, that I would have an opportunity to make systemic changes to the way my office operated. And in 2013, Brooklyn had a very contested election. My boss at the time, Charles Hines, lost to Ken Thompson, who became the first African-American DA in Brooklyn. And it was a turning point for me because Ken gave me the opportunity to join his executive team and ultimately made me his chief assistant. And it was very clear that my office had lost its way during the broken window era of policing because, like Tori said, we became case processors. We continued to put cases through the system that did not serve a legitimate public safety value. And it's one of the things that we first took a look at. So when Ken appointed me chief assistant, two things he asked me to take a look at. One was what we were going to do with all these marijuana cases. We had something like 17,000 people arrested in Brooklyn alone for small possession of marijuana. 90% of them were either black or Hispanic. And the cases cost a lot of money to prosecute. There was a very small public safety value in prosecuting these cases. And we saw that the racial disparity was obscene. Brooklyn is about 42% African American, 20% Hispanic, so 62%, black and Hispanic. But we made up, actually, was about 93% of the arrest in the marijuana cases. And so we came up with a policy. I helped draft a policy that we weren't going to prosecute these cases anymore. And that ultimately led to this, the mayor of the city of New York to join that in that policy and change it. So tens of thousands of people were not being prosecuted in those cases. And a professor here from Harvard I helped recruit to come over to the Brooklyn DA's office while he was on sabbatical, Professor Sullivan, Ron Sullivan, and we created this conviction review unit. And we looked at these wrongful conviction matters. In Brooklyn, we so far have found 23 people convicted, mostly of murder, that were deprived due process, were unfairly tried, did not get fairness, and in many cases were actually innocent. And so we've been continuing to do that work. The reason I mention all of this, because it is this area which excites me being here today, because I'm looking for prosecutors who want to make a difference in what the lives of people look like in various communities. Brooklyn is a large jurisdiction. It's 2.6 million people. It's really a melting pot. People come from all over the world. 1 out of 3 people in Brooklyn are immigrants. And, so we have a lot of needs in the community, and we're looking for prosecutors who want to make a difference in their lives. I know so there's a lot of people who wanted to be prosecutors. I'm very happy to hear that, because when I graduated from law school, I think there was about 3 people in my law school who wanted to be prosecutors. And there's a tremendous opportunity for people who come in with goodwill to come in and to change the face of prosecution. It's very important for me, having grown up in East New York, that we focus in on keeping our community safe. All the prosecutors here will tell you that it's a fundamental core principle and obligation to make sure communities are safe. But the way we do that has to be re-examined, and that's what fair and just prosecution is about, looking at how we go about keeping communities safe. And so for me, in Brooklyn, it's about 0.5% of the population that commits 70% of the crime. And so we have a very focused approach in how we try to decrease violent crime by going after what we call the drivers of crime. And we do that. So there's about 13,000 people that we monitor in Brooklyn, that we pay attention to every time they get arrested, until we monitor social media. We're really being very careful every time they get in trouble. But what that has meant for us in Brooklyn is that in about 3 years' time, we were able to reduce the number of people getting arrested by over 25%. We went from 117, almost 118,000 arrests shortly before Ken Thompson was elected to under 79,000 this past year. And we're even lower this year. So we're going to continue to do that, focusing in on the real drivers of crime while giving all of you the opportunity to make a difference in what fairness looks like in the criminal justice system. And I say this because I hope it matters to people. Brooklyn continues to get safer while we continue to provide more fairness. And so what do I mean by that? When I became a prosecutor, when I was applying to the DA's office, there were 821 homicides in Brooklyn. Just in Brooklyn. There were over 2,000 in New York City, but just over 820. As I sit here today, there's about, at least as of this morning, there were 71 homicides in Brooklyn. And so there is proof that you can reform the criminal justice system, but keep people safe.
Christian, so you come from, you're the district attorney in Winnebago County in Wisconsin. You've been in that position since 2007, so you're the most senior of district attorneys of electeds here in the group. Your district, I think, is perhaps more conservative than some of the other districts that we've been hearing about. And you have tried to pursue reforms in your district, for example, with respect to bail. Can you talk about the dynamics there of doing that in a more conservative district, and what are the politics like? Are you vulnerable to being accused of soft on crime? How do you navigate that?
And I always have to jokingly tell people Winnebago County is halfway between Chicago and Canada, because I know nobody here knows where that is. Wisconsin right now, Republicans control pretty much everything. I'm a Republican, come from a pretty conservative district. I think most of our elected officials are Republicans. And when I ran in 2006, it was a hotly contested race, and I ran on a smart on crime agenda about 10 years earlier than it became popular. But it worked out, and we've run into a lot of support, and we've also run into a lot of resistance. I can be a very abrasive person, or so my judges have told me, and I push my agenda regardless of re-election, which I think is one of the things that's really helped out. I've never really given a lot of thought to whether or not I'd get re-elected again. We haven't made our decisions based that way. But a lot of what I've run into is the system itself. People resist change overall. It doesn't really matter what side of the fence you're on. People get comfortable and they like what they know. And trying to change that up took a lot of effort. And I still run into issues. We've tried to reform bail or bond issues when people are arrested and held in custody because they can't post small cash bonds. One of the things that we tried to do was we studied the issue, and we looked at the people who are in our jail. We found that we had a lot of people who are getting arrested and being held on $100 to $500 cash bonds. So we took a bunch of different steps in our office, tried to change our policies and procedures to get those people's cases addressed early, get them out on signature bonds as quickly as we could. We were able to bring that down to about 2 days of incarceration for our indigent defendants, which was a pretty good improvement unless you're the person sitting in jail for 2 days. And when we tried to cut that down even further, I suggested to my judges that they could release these people on signature bonds over the weekends without the DA's office having an appearance. We'd just waive our appearance on all of those. And all 6 of my judges have so far not done that over the last year. And there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear in the system, a lot of concern that if you release somebody, they'll do something bad, you won't get reelected. And so there's fear and there's apprehension. And I think we've all seen those bad cases where something happens and then the community rises up against an elected official. And having those conversations and trying to quell some of those conversations is difficult, and I'm probably just one bad incident away from losing my position, but I think it's just one of those careers that you make the most of, and you know, there's such great positions to be in, especially when you're the elected district attorney. You have the ability to do so much good and bring about so much change that you really just have to be willing to take the chances and do it.
So Christian, Mark and Tori and Eric talked about you know, kind of building up credibility and relationships with the community. Is that and so perhaps when that case goes bad, somebody that you agreed to release commits a crime that hits the front pages, perhaps you're a little bit, you know, have a little bit of a buffer, a little money in the bank with the community. Is that something that you're able to do in your community?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, data, evidence-based decision-making, I think Tori was touching on that. As we move towards an analytical approach to criminal justice and we start keeping track of what's happening with cases and we see the successes, I think it does insulate you from the one bad incident. And those bad incidents are going to happen. They just will. It's happened to me. I believe Tori said earlier it's happened to her. I did have somebody who was responsible for a homicide that I had cut a break to. You know, but the population that we're dealing with and the types of cases that we're dealing with, you have to assume those risks, and over time you do start to build credibility with your community, and you can point to the track record. You can show, you know, the changes in people's lives for the positive, and yeah, hopefully the community stays with that thought process.
So I'm going to come to those that I haven't asked questions of yet in a second, but to the whole group I want to ask this question. You know, of course, the nationally, federally, there was this election that happened last November, and you know, the politics on criminal justice changed dramatically in the U.S. Federal Justice Department. Is that and so that's the first thing, and the second thing is there is a little bit of data coming out suggesting that although you know that crime rates remain historically low. You know, Eric shared dramatic figures about Brooklyn, but there are a few cities where there are some spikes. Now, are either of those two things, or both of those two things, do they imperil or threaten the kinds of reforms that you want to pursue, or do you see on the state level that there is still the space to pursue reform, smart on crime, the kind of changes that you have been talking about? Anybody who wants to jump in on this one?
So I think that the tough on crime rhetoric that's coming from D.C. will give an opportunity for prosecutors who want to take up that mantle to continue that approach. I think that we're at historic lows in crime, especially violent crime in America, with the exception of, you know, a small increase from the last 2 years. We're still at very low levels. But I think what we really need to focus in on is, do the reforms to the criminal justice system actually make us safer? And I believe that they do. I think the argument should not be that we have to go back to mandatory minimums or sending people who are addicted to drugs to prison in order to keep safety. In fact, I think it's the opposite. And I'll give an example from Brooklyn. You know, in Brooklyn, we created a young adult court. The young adult court in Brooklyn goes from 16 all the way to 24 years of age, and that's because the science behind the brain development says that for the most part, our brain is not fully formed until 25 years of age. When I look at what we've done to young children in Brooklyn over the last 20 years, what I saw was it was all about punishment. They would get arrested, they would come to court, they would plead guilty to some offense or crime, and then they would receive a punishment. Sometimes the punishment was community service, sometimes it was probation, sometimes it was jail. But we never got to the underlying causes of why they were behaving that way. And so what I did in Brooklyn, I applied for a smart prosecution grant from the United States government, from DOJ. And what happens now is when a person is arrested and they're brought into our criminal court, a young person, the first person they meet after getting arraigned by the court is a social worker. And the social worker looks to try to figure out why they're there in the first place. And we create individualized mandates for them. So for some people, it's a drug or mental health issue, and so they need to get treatment or rehabilitation. For some people, they have anger issues. And I believe that if we're going to get to the root cause and continue to drive down crime, we have to make sure that we do crime prevention. And I believe that a young person who's given the tools and the skills necessary to be successful, sometimes we just need to re-enroll the person into school, sometimes it's job training, but that they're less likely to commit crime. And we heard the number earlier today. This is about a 70% recidivism rate for young people. So we know what we've done in the past was not working for these people. So what we're trying is something different. We're trying to get them the skills and really kind of doing the work that all of you think that we're doing in our courthouses, which is trying to prevent people from reoffending. It's about accountability, but it should not be simply about punishment. And so I think that this time, even though the rhetoric is coming from DC that says you have to get tough on crime, I believe that you can also be smart and just continuing to make these reform-minded changes that will lead us to safety. People ask me all the time, you know, how did Brooklyn do it? And one of the things, if you look, is that Brooklyn had a reputation for a long time as being one of the more progressive places in America in dealing with people who were charged with crime and giving them diversion, giving them treatment, and continuing to focus our precious, criminal justice resources on improving people's lives and not simply about punishing them. So I think there's an opportunity for all of us to continue to speak out, and I say again to all of you, to really make a difference in communities, continue to promote safety, and really to have fundamental fairness in our criminal justice system.
Sorry.
Beth, you wanted to add something?
Yeah,
So
well,
Beth
just-
is, just to introduce, if I can say, Beth was elected last November 2016 as the first woman DA in Denver.
Yes, thank you. It's quite an honor. And I just wanted to point out that the nice thing about being an independently elected state prosecutor is that we are not subject to the rhetoric coming out of the federal government in any legal sense. So we decide in our offices what kind of cases we're going to bring, what kind of plea bargains we're going to offer, what kind of sentences we may recommend. And although there is, I do think the federal rhetoric is giving people of that ilk maybe more confidence in expressing their opinions. As far as what I do in Denver, or what Eric does in Brooklyn, or what Tori does in California, we make those decisions. So that is something that's really encouraging. And I also would like to point out that there are conservative groups that are very interested in reform as well. There's a group called Right on Crime, which is based in Texas and is supported by the Koch brothers. And they have partnered with some of our left-leaning liberal groups to push Congress to be more cognizant of mandatory minimum sentences and trying to reduce mandatory minimum sentences. We all thought it was going to pass last year, but it didn't. So I don't know if we'll see that bill again until the current administration is out of office. But I do think it's important to remember that this is a coalition not just of sort of progressives, but also some conservatives as well.
Melissa, I'm going to turn to you. You became the prosecutor in Jacksonville after you defeated a very powerful and I would say infamous incumbent who had, among other things, failed in the prosecution in the Trayvon Martin case. Can you talk about the dynamics that allowed you to succeed in that election, and what kind of reforms are you hoping to bring to your office?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with all of you today. This month, I am a lawyer for 20 years, and I started my career as a prosecutor. I went to law school because I wanted to be a trial lawyer, and I wanted to be a prosecutor. So I look out and at many of you today, those of you who raised your hand and have those same desires and vision for yourselves. It's great to be with all of you. So how I jumped into politics it was unexpected. It was not on my bucket list. It was not on my goal sheet. It was not where I thought I would be in my career. I am the daughter of parents who, my father spent his entire career in law enforcement, and I loved hearing about his work. And I was always interested in mystery, and when Law and Order came out, I became an avid and still remain a loyal viewer of that show, and I just loved everything about criminal law. It was one of my favorite studies in law school, and I really enjoyed trial practice. So becoming a prosecutor was something that I wanted to do, and I envisioned I would spend my career there. I spent most of my time in violent crimes, although I worked in every area of the office. And there was an election in 2008 and a change. I had enjoyed a lot of stability as an assistant state attorney there. And there was a change in the direction and the policies of the office. And I stayed for some time, almost a year, and didn't have the power at that time or the voice to really redirect what I thought was a poor direction of our office. What I loved about being a prosecutor, for those of you who are thinking about it, and even for those of you who are thinking about being public defenders, is I loved that I went to work every day with one mission, and it was to do what I believed was right. And that looked very different depending on the case, the offense, and the facts and circumstances of an individual matter. And I took a lot of pride in that. And so I felt that that autonomy and that discretion had been taken away from me. And so I made the decision to leave. And I, as a 12-year criminal government lawyer with no book of business to sell a firm, decided to reinvent myself and become a civil litigator. I was very fortunate. A great firm hired me. And I, head down, went to reinvent myself and my practice. And I will tell you that for the first year that I got off of these shiny elevators in a beautiful firm, I felt like I did not belong. And I worked hard to rededicate myself to a different area of practice. But I continued to watch the decisions of that office because that office mattered dearly to me. I met and married my husband while I was working there. We had all 3 of our children while I was working there. And as I told you before, I thought I would end my career there. So I continued to watch the decisions of the office and had an opportunity to become an adversary to my office, which was also not part of my plan. The office indicted a young child as an adult for the murder of his brother, and at 12 years old, he was placed in solitary confinement in our local pretrial detention facility until our chief judge declared his confinement cruel and unusual. I tell you all that just to say that all of a sudden, I'm at this firm and a group of lawyers call on me to help in the background and ghostwrite and give advice to the Office of the Public Defender. So I became involved with this group of lawyers, and ultimately we took over the defense of this case. And I found myself in a position I never expected to be, and that was on the other side of the table from former colleagues of mine and friends of mine. But I felt very strongly about the case. And ultimately, I started looking for someone, another lawyer, not me, to actually run and challenge my predecessor. Because I really believed that there was an imbalance in the justice system. And I, unlike some of my colleagues up here, have found that change in my jurisdiction has not been very difficult. In fact, it's been welcomed. And ultimately, I think to your question, long way to get to an answer, but the reason that my campaign was successful is I think that people, while all of us want to be safe, we want to feel safe in our homes, we want to feel safe walking down our street, we all also share a desire for fairness. It struck me one day when I was on the t-ball field with my boys, and I was watching my husband coach, and I thought from a very young age, we teach our kids to play hard, but we teach them to play fair. We expect the same out of our justice system. There's lots that's been written about procedural justice and that feeling of fairness. And so it seemed to me that whether fair or not, our community had lost that sense of fairness and fair play. And I hated it for an office I cared about, I hated it for my community, and I hated it for the justice system because I've always cared a lot about the justice system. So when no one else said yes, that they were willing to do it, I jumped into politics, which, not being, again, part of my plan, felt compelled to do it. And the message about fairness that I believed people cared about really resonated. I think that people, and I started in January with a speech to the group of prosecutors now that I'm really fortunate to work with. And I told them that I wanted our office to, again, earn the reputation for being tenacious, but I wanted everyone who had contact with our office, whether it was a victim, a witness, or an accused, to leave their interaction with our office believing that how they were treated by our office was fair. Whether or not they liked the outcome, that they believed they were given a fair shake. So all of the reforms and priorities of my first year agenda, they've been with that fairness aspect as central to all of the reforms. You've heard a lot about public safety, and obviously that's the mission of every state attorney's office, and prosecutors every day go to work thinking about how they can keep their communities safe. So obviously that's a primary objective of our reforms, but certainly restoring fairness to the way we do things has been a central tenet to those. Those include a conviction integrity unit that we've announced and not yet staffed, but looking for the director. We've got a pilot working group on a community prosecution effort that will hopefully be rolled out in the next year. And the goal of that is to engage our assistant state attorneys in the community in a way that historically we haven't been. So prosecutors get involved and are engaged in the justice system after what? The bad things already happened. So the philosophy of community prosecution is that prosecutors actually get to know a community, the business leaders, the faith leaders, the people who live in a community, and develop relationships with them so that when we need actually to call a witness in and we need information and we need to know what's going on, we have a relationship. And the thought is that we will approach problems that might cause crime, such as the example that's given often is lighting on a basketball court. We can seek to solve problems in a collaborative effort as opposed to our first interaction with members of a community being only after the bad thing has happened. We've started an advisory panel, a community advisory panel on juvenile justice issues. And we also have, at the same time while we've been implementing what I consider to be reforms, which have been greeted, I think, with at least apparently enthusiasm in my community, we've also been, I think, much smarter and strategic in the way that we've deployed our talent and resources for the violence where I actually think we can make a difference. So I simplify it with two-prong. For the people who we can circumvent around the criminal justice system, we're focusing resources on doing that. And for the small group of people who actually do wreak the havoc and really hurt people and hurt our community, we're making sure that we're being strategic and targeted in our approach with those offenders as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing and how I got to where I am. It wasn't on my bucket list.
And we were talking earlier, you have a graduate of this law school who's about to start in your office.
I am so proud of this fact. I have to tell you, being here, I mean, I understand you're a large law school, but there's such a small percentage of lawyers who practice in our country that have the privilege of being able to say they are Harvard Law graduates. I just have such awe for all of you for being here. And when we came in, part of restoring the reputation, I wanted to make sure we were taking recruiting very seriously. And that meant that we actively recruited, and I'm so proud of the class that we've brought in. And we have brought in a Harvard law graduate who has decided to return to her hometown. I was laughing earlier, we got her resume and it was incredible, and before she walked in the door, we were all convinced that something must be terribly wrong. And we were so impressed with her humility and the reason that she wanted to do the work that she's doing now, and that had to do with service, which is something you talked about, some of the attributes you're looking for in prosecutors. There's lots of different reasons why you may be drawn to the work. One of my favorite things about being a prosecutor was actually not being in trial. I loved that, but it was making a case, investigating a case, putting a case together, and often difficult cases. I loved that part of the job. So there's lots of different reasons that people come to the job, but one of the things that we're looking for is the attitude and the desire to serve the public. Because as a prosecutor, we have tremendous power. We, with the stroke of our pen, can change the trajectory of multiple lives at one time. And so we have to, foremost, I believe, every day that we come to work, remember that we serve the public, despite the fact that we have a great amount of power. So I'm very proud of the fact that the Fourth Judicial Circuit now has a Harvard law graduate in our starting fall class. I think it's great. And so if any of you are interested in talking afterwards, I am very interested in talking to all of you.
I'm going to take the mic and say, come to Kansas first.
We'll have a little job fair afterwards. Beth, I'm going to come back to you, and Andrew, I haven't forgotten about you. Beth, we've heard a lot about Smart on Crime, about focusing on the people who are the small number of people who are committing the crimes, but not over prosecuting, about relationships with the community, about programs of integrity, fairness. I want to ask you about a specific goal that you announced with you, as I understand it, with your election last year, which was to address the disproportionate incarceration of people of color. Can you talk about that goal and how you've gone about that in your job?
Sure, thank you. So I think we've talked a little bit about the fact that people of color are impacted often in greater percentages than others in our system. So one of the things that I did when I was elected is I gave every member of my office a copy of the book, The New Jim Crow. I don't know, we're getting some nods, so you might have read it, or maybe it was required reading. It's written by a law professor, Michelle Alexander. And so one of my African-American friends gave it to me when I was running for office, and so I read it. She talks about her belief that our criminal justice system has sort of taken over as sort of the Jim Crow era faded out, the actual segregation era, that our criminal justice system is sort of functioning in a similar manner. So, and particularly, I think what she talked about is that, like when we started the war on drugs back in the 80s, gosh, I guess they were alive then, right? These
Yeah, a few, just barely.
Just teasing. So anyway, that war on drugs sort of ended up with a disparate impact on people of color, primarily because our federal government declared this was a big war and began to fund efforts to arrest and prosecute people who were engaged in selling drugs. And because it was easier to make those arrests in the minority communities, that's where law enforcement focused quite a bit. And as we all know, where the money goes, that's where people go. So law enforcement, district attorney's office wanted that extra money, so they focused on that. At any rate, it sort of resulted in this impact on communities where a lot of young, particularly African American, some Latino, so were taken out of their communities and leaving then this big void, which disrupts the neighborhoods, disrupts the communities. So we then started some discussions in our office about the book, and I think it was interesting because a number of the prosecutors were pretty defensive about the whole concept because, you know, the feeling is we only get cases that come to us from the police department. So we treat everybody the same and we don't discriminate. And so having them think a little bit more, a little bit deeper about how can we influence this trend, I think has been helpful. But I have to say, I'm kind of struggling now with where do we go, because we are gathering some data in our office, and I think Tori mentioned data is not a strength of a lot of prosecutors' offices, so my office wasn't keeping good data. So we're trying to collect data about how do we treat different ethnic groups, different races in our office to make sure that we are not engaging in implicit bias, and if we are, to address it. So I think this is a really complicated topic, and there are no easy answers, but I think the more prosecutors are cognizant of their role in this and trying to protect the integrity of communities, that we will be able to have an influence.
Andrew, you are the prosecutor, the state attorney in Tampa. You came to the job by a different path, but you were a federal prosecutor for a number of years and before you became state attorney. I wonder if you could talk about your perspective, having been a federal prosecutor, on some of the issues that are being talked about here, and in particular, picking up a little bit on what Beth just said, what are some of the, there's been a lot, you've talked all very eloquently and inspirationally, if I can say, about what you're trying to do. Can you talk about some of the challenges, some of the limitations on your ability to accomplish change as a prosecutor, whether they be institutional or budgetary or political, any of those things?
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I think it's a little bit unfair that I had to go last because I'm the youngest, but that's okay.
That's why you went last.
Maybe it's because I went to Columbia, but anyway. So I came into this with a background as a Fed, as you said, and I was taught early in my career as a federal prosecutor that my job was simple. It's to do the right thing. I had a lot of discretion in types of crimes and the people that we prosecuted. There were a lot of people that we let go who had committed crimes because we were focusing on a larger target. And I felt like it was prosecution at its best from a prosecutorial discretion standpoint. And then I came over to the state system, and I had started my career in state court in DC, but I've come back to the state system now, and you see a lot of the institutional hurdles that exist where most of the 130 assistants in my office don't see their job as exercising discretion. They don't see their job as problem solving, which it should be. They don't see their job, which to me is fundamentally what it should be, about how do we achieve long-term safety for the community, long-term being the key word. They see their job as prosecuting the case that's in front of them and moving on to the next case, because we have about 60,000 cases a year we do in our district. And so I've had to retrain people, and I've started by trying to change the culture in our office that as prosecutors, you guys are trying to do what all of my colleagues up here have talked about. This is about how do we build a safer community? How do we promote fairness and justice in the system? Your job is not, and this is what I tell my assistants, your job is not simply to view each case as a person to be prosecuted, but as a problem to be solved. So the limits that we face are, one, the volume of cases. Coming from the federal system, I could spend a lot more time on each case trying to determine, okay, what's the best outcome here? What are the appropriate charges? Who do we let go? Who do we try to actually use the hammer against? In state court, you don't have that luxury. We have different, deal with a lot of different law enforcement agencies, judges, the rules. Everything in the system is set up to just continue rolling over what we're doing. It's a lot of lather, rinse, repeat, lather, rinse, repeat. That's how the system is set up because of the amount of volume there. And so that's the biggest hurdle we've faced is how do you train people when they've been doing their job? And look, I've been there 9 months now, and there are people who have been there for 29 years. And I'm trying to retrain them to think about their job in a completely different, from a different perspective. That their job is to build a safer community, to ensure justice and fairness for everyone who comes through the system, not simply to prosecute the case in front of them.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to open it up to questions from all of you. I would ask that you make your question as specific as possible so that we can get as many questions in as possible, and you can address it to the entire group or to any one or several individual prosecutors if you wish. I'll get Charlie first, and then...
We have mics here.
Oh, excellent. Then I can stay put.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a 3L, and I'm also a joint degree student in public policy at the Kennedy School. My question is actually about data. So this was mentioned by many of you, and specifically that data is not a strength of DA offices. So I'm wondering, how are your offices making data a strength, especially since data and quantitative skill sets are not something that's taught in law schools?
Let me do this. I'm going to take a few questions, and then I'm going to sort of throw it to you. So take notes. You had a question.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a 1L. Mr. Warren, actually, you answered part of my question, which was how do you...
I get an A, right?
Excellent.
How do you retrain an entire office? Because obviously being the state attorney or the district attorney is different from being in charge of the entire office. But from the other perspective, at those of us who are just entering the legal field, what can a young prosecutor do? What power do they have to affect change in the system as opposed to simply prosecuting the case that's in front of them?
Let's take one more question. Yes.
Hi, my name's Alex Derensberg from Bakersfield, California, but previously living in Brooklyn. I'm a 1L as well. And a few of you have spoken about relationships with the police department as well as judges. We know that you each kind of control your office, but I'm curious about the relationships you've been able to cultivate with your partnering offices who are also part of the criminal justice system, and how they've helped, or maybe where you've faced obstacles in bringing about the change that you want to bring about.
So data, training, and partnering with with law enforcement, for example. Who wants to go first? Mark, you want to?
Take the data one.
You take the data one, and then
Yeah.
Mark, you jump. Yeah.
I'll jump in after that.
Okay. So with a lot of the systems that are in place for courts, prosecutors' offices, they're really like electronic filing cabinets. They're not really systems that have been designed to collect and interpret data so that you can have useful information. And what we did starting in 2007 was we started collecting our own data. And I had a really sophisticated system that I'd use with Excel spreadsheets and hash marks. And over the last decade, we've now had some computer systems written. We've partnered with NYU, BetaGov, Litmus Labs, and even locally UW Oshkosh. So we reached out, and we've worked with the people who know how to collect data. We've actually run 2 field studies, field experiments, natural field experiments out of our office in conjunction with UW Oshkosh, in part because we believe that the smart on crime approach to things will pay dividends in the end, but we've had to study it ourselves. And so the data isn't out there, but it can be, and there's more and more emphasis, I think, every year on creating systems that are capable of producing information that can be analyzed. So over time, I think it's getting better, but really we're so far behind in our data collection in the criminal justice system.
I'll jump in concerning the training and what you can do while yet in law school, and even first jumping out there and starting out. I mean, I come from a background of having practiced defense work before I became the DA, and with that, as well as being the first elected African American in the state of Kansas to hold this position, I found that the best way to really help is to be passionate, practical, and progressive. Practical, progressive, and passionate. I don't care however you say them, just kid all 3 of them, okay? But what you should not be is passive. One of the things that I find in my state and with many prosecutors across the country is their inability to be trained, their inability to accept the culture and the history that the foundation of our offices stand on. there is past, as my wife's mother told me when I was marrying her daughter 10 years ago. She said, son, everyone has a past. Get over it and start your newness. Well, I believe it's the same way. If we go into this thing thinking, oh, discrimination doesn't exist, oh, there is no racial tension, oh, the police loves everyone, and they don't arrest black people more. You've been passive and ignorant, okay? Hopefully I didn't offend you, Harvard folks, but that's the reality, okay? So to be passionate and progressive and practical means to, yeah, so what? Some of our founding fathers or whoever you want to call them made some stupid decisions and some stupid mistakes, which by now means that 95% and more of the prosecutors in this country are Caucasian men who have been dealing with the same thought process for years. So now you have progressives who are coming in and say, yes, that's a problem. We need to deal with it. How can you separate crack from cocaine? Duh, you can't. You still get your high. Don't deal with the fight. Let's focus on, okay, that was stupid. Let's lock up who we need to lock up. And I want to say this because we really been talking about smart prosecution, but I don't want you to get it mixed, right? I grew up and I saw and I ran from bullets. The stupidity of the people who were shooting, they need to be locked up. That's not something we need to say, oh, let's give them a second chance. No, they shot at me, man. Right? So the heinous crimes, some people need to be in prison, but not all people. So what can you do? You be practical, you be smart, and you come up with resolutions. And for my office, we kept a lot of people, but we also fired a lot of people because some people were not trainable. Rather than fighting with them, say, God bless you, and go on to wherever you're going, because we have to do what I believe it was the Gerber v. United States case who said that prosecutors are ministers of justice. We are servants of the law. We are not political, advantageous fighters to climb some ladder. No, you are a servant. You are a minister of justice, and if anything gets in that way, then you're not going to fulfill what your job is.
Just to follow up on that, it's not much more to be said after that, but amen.
I'll take that amen, brother.
But as a young prosecutor or as an intern, we take interns in the office and we allow our legal interns to actually handle cases. I don't want this to be lost on anyone, that every case you handle, there's lives at stake. There's the witnesses, the victims of the crime, the accused. And so when you ask what a 1L can do, if you're handling a case, you have to bring justice to that case. There's many lives, and the decisions that young prosecutors make impact communities each and every day. And having grown up in a community that was very heavily involved in the criminal justice system, when DAs got it wrong, the community suffered. And we learned that both in our wrongful conviction matters, but we also learned it in the non-prosecution of cases that should have been prosecuted. So we need to be mindful that what you do in this field is very important to the lives of our community. And so I think, I really do encourage folks who want to make a difference to give this a shot.
Just to jump into the question, I appreciate two other people answering the question that started out with Mr. Warren, but anyway. Politics.
You are the youngest.
The two questions that you addressed, one, how did I change the culture, and what can you do as a young prosecutor? I was asked the other day, how much discretion do I give to the prosecutors in my office? And the answer was, I give as much discretion as guidance. I don't trust people to make decisions until I've told them what I expect from them. So they have very little discretion to make decisions until I've told them how I want them to handle cases. So I started out on day one, like Melissa referenced, explaining my vision to the office of what it meant, and I'll spare you the speech. But I've followed up on a regular basis sitting down with the prosecutors to say, this is what I think justice looks like. This is what your job needs to be. This is what you need to be doing. On particular types of cases, we've talked about this is how charges should be filed. This is the sentencing we should be looking to achieve. This is how we protect the rights of victims. So I've led them on a regular basis, and then I've given them the discretion to act in accordance to how I've guided them. What can you do as a young prosecutor? You have to embrace the discretion that you have. Sitting here, frankly, is a first step, because so many prosecutors come in thinking that they're going to make a difference. They want to serve the public. They see that first case they get, and oh my God, this case is the greatest threat to public safety since whatever, and it's a jaywalking case. But they're gung-ho about doing it, which is a good thing, but they need to understand the broader perspective. They need to understand what their job is. And to go back to what I said before, it's not about simply prosecuting people. It's not about locking people up. It's about how do we make a safer community? How do we ensure that there's fairness and justice in the system? So as a young prosecutor, you absorb and embrace those ideas, and then you go and practice it every day.
And if I could, just to the last question, which was brilliant, might I add. And I'm just a little biased because you're from California. But no, that's a very good question. It really is a very tough question because it's one that we struggle with every day. Because as you know, law enforcement, if we were a restaurant, they're the ones that would bring us their food every day. You know, we can't do business without them. So law enforcement brings us every case. So we obviously have a close relationship with them. We work with them thousands and thousands and thousands of times. And as we go through our careers, whether you might be in narcotics, or you might be in gangs, or in homicides, or more of our vertical, if you will, prosecutions, child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, you find you work with them even more and more because you're constantly doing bigger cases, whether you're doing wiretaps or whatever you might be doing. You're spending more and more time with law enforcement. And as elected officials, we tend to seek their endorsement. Because then it, without saying it, says that you're tough on crime if law enforcement endorses you, if the police believe in you and the sheriff believes in you. So it's a weird relationship in that sense that we're dependent upon each other. But then it gets tough because now we start prosecuting, and that's one of the first things. My grandfather was the sheriff. My father and 3 of my uncles did 35 years with Stockton Police. My brother just did 32 with the sheriff's office, and my nephew just got sworn in. So I'm 4th generation law enforcement. I'm the one that made the bad career choice, went to law school. So they, because they're all retired, but they, but one of the things, so it's very tough. So now you go from being a line attorney for the most part, and I think everybody had spent time in their office before they were elected, to working closely with them, to being the person who could charge them and who would be responsible for making a determination as to whether or not they were culpable as things from misdemeanor DUI to murder, because depending on what your response is to the officer-involved critical incidents. So now you're in this different role, and these are the same people that you've worked with every day. These are the same people that have endorsed your campaign, or maybe not, and now you have to make that decision. And there's no way that you can't say you don't have some sort of relationship there. But as part of the parcel of the job and what you're sworn to under oath to do is uphold the law, and it's imperative that you treat everybody the same. You have to do that. And so you have to put all that aside and make those decisions. And it's tough because as soon as you make that decision, I'm charging an officer right now, and nobody speaks to me. They want to run a candidate against me. There's just that knee-jerk reaction. Why are you doing this? We thought you were with us. You know, all that kind of stuff. Well, the guy committed a crime, so why am I going to treat him differently? You know, we treat everybody the same. But you do get that. You do get that kind of, and the relationship gets strained. And the same goes when you go after, with the judges, because sometimes the judges think that they're the almighty, and you have to go in there sometimes and say, hey, we're, separate but equal, and we've got to keep it that way because we have to be able to respect each other, but we also have to be able to treat each other with the same dignity and equality that we did. And so it's tough. It's a really tough balance that we struggle with every day. At least I do. I struggle with to remain open and receptive to working with law enforcement and working with the judges, but also being that person that has to come down when it's necessary and bring those charges against them. And so you're hoping as time goes on and officers become more and more aware, and I think really the critical thing is body cams. Body cams has opened the door. It's opened the door. People have been talking about abuse for a long time. And maybe we didn't hear it. Maybe we didn't want to see it. I don't know. But now we got video that's showing us it has happened. And it's a small percentage. It's the same small percentage that of lawyers that aren't that great, of doctors that aren't that great. You know, there's going to be a percentage in every profession that don't do it justice, that don't do what they're supposed to do. But body cams has shown that. And so we have to embrace that. We have to address it, and we have to deal with it. And so I think it's important that you have that relationship with them, because you need to have a dialogue, but you also have to keep that professional distance, that you will be the one that brings the charges. There's no other agency unless you guys have one.
Having just very recently run in September during the Democratic primary, I think that it was important for me to establish, and I'm a career prosecutor. I've been in the office for over 20 years. I was the chief assistant for the past several years. But I ran, and I made it very clear, and I did get the endorsement of the PBA, but I think that a prosecutor has a different job than the police department. And, you know, so I made that very much part of my public persona. I do not work for the police department. I work with them, but I'm an independent law enforcement agency, and I have a different set of goals at the end. You know, the officers on the street often respond to an issue. And they're there to make an arrest and to often end something that was happening, or, you know. But my job is completely different than the officer's job. Yes, we're both involved in public safety, but ultimately my job is about justice. And, you know, many of the cases that we've, you know, referred to in this case, people may actually be guilty, but we're still saying a non-prosecution is warranted. This is the job of justice, requires that we be independent of our police department. And so I think that is how we get along, honestly, is by being very clear that often the officers have to handle, you know, difficult situations on the street. But when the case comes before the district attorney's office, it really is about what's the just result. And, you know, the ethos, the hardest part of changing an office, like my office has over 1,200 people, is changing the ethos that it's not about securing the conviction, it's about doing the right thing. And I think if you can continuously speak on that issue, then there's a lot less hard feelings when you go a different way than the police department. I mean, quite frankly, we decline to prosecute cases in the interest of justice. Not saying that the officers did anything wrong in making the arrest, but the goals and the needs of the community don't require a prosecution of that particular offense at that time. So I just think that's really important to always keep in mind, that prosecutors don't work for the police department.
Tapped onto it. If you're running for any office, and I hope all of you would consider running for office, because it is a wonderful journey, but you are here for a limited time. It should not be your goal to be elected a DA for the rest of your life. You get 4 years. If you make that, great, and you get another 4, fabulous. But if you don't while you're here, you better make the best of it, because otherwise you're just too much of a coward to be in that position. So if you're going to run for the right reasons, and don't worry about the consequences, because every time I do anything, somebody always threatens to run against me. Well, I ran for office, thus I expected to run again, and that somebody would be on the other side. So I can't exactly be shocked when somebody says we're going to run a candidate against you, because to me, that's so offensive that you're using that as a threat to keep me from doing justice, from what's doing right. I find that more motivation for me to run. Now, I'm a short Catholic Irish Italian. You don't need to piss me off. I'm pretty much in that state all the time. So, you know, so that just makes me more motivated to run, because I think that's so offensive that somebody thinks they have the power to keep you from what's doing right by threatening you to run against you. And to me, whenever you see those kind of reactions, and when you see people, and it could be anything, it could be a small case. We prosecuted a case over people selling food on Facebook. Okay, well, there was no codes, there was no health. It was people had served the food to their family last night. They took the leftovers and sold it online the next day. So I had to step in. We tried to do it equitably. We talked to them. We met with them. We discussed it with them. We talked about the concerns. We tried to connect them to code. We did everything we could. That case took off nationally, made into the New York Times, the Washington Post, things like of that nature. So you never know which case it's going to be, one that I never thought in a million years I would have a conversation about. I had many conversations about. And people were screaming, you know, why are you doing this? Why should you do this? You should be out. You know, I had death threats over Cervici. So I really didn't know I would wake up and my day would be that journey. But so, you know, you have to have that power if you're going to stay in this office, any office, whether you're going to be the mayor or the city council member or the school board. You have to do it for the right reasons, and you have to do it every day for the right reasons, and never be afraid. Even though there's times you will be, never be afraid to do what is right. Because if you don't, then you shouldn't be in that position. And we have enough elected officials who are disappointing us on a daily basis. You know, we don't need any more. And I don't mean it just from that, but I meant who have done fraud and crimes and things like of that nature. What we need is people with courage who are willing to stand up and say, bring everything you've got, because I'm ready for the battle. So I hope you will do that. I hope you will consider running for office someday when you get to that journey. And I hope you will have the courage, as all of my colleagues here do, to always do the right thing every day, no matter what the consequence. Do the right thing, because in the end, that's all that really matters. So thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to give the mic to Miriam just for 1 minute. She mentioned the fellowship program that we're trying to put together. Maybe she can just say where to look out for future information about that. Then I'm going to thank our panelists, and then we will go. I invite you all to join us at the reception, where you can talk to all of these amazing prosecutors one-on-one.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And I'm acutely aware that I'm standing between you all and the food, so I'm going to be very short. Two things. One is you all got an evaluation form. It would be very helpful if you could fill it in. If you don't have one, raise your hand, and Hannah will get you one. And then second of all, the FJP Fellows Program, there is a sheet on it. I think it's outside the door. It is a program that we are starting in 3 law schools, Harvard, NYU, and Stanford. We are looking for a small group. We intend to be selective, but if you're interested in spending a summer in a progressive prosecutor's office and being networked with other like-minded fellows around the country, you'll have opportunity to do some policy work as well as work in the office. There will be a most likely small stipend associated with it as well. And our hope is that the policy project will continue into your 2L or 3L year. You'll be working with one of the prosecutor's offices in our network, so these individuals or others, with an opportunity, obviously, for you to guide where you end up. We're not looking to stick you in, Kansas City if you're not interested, although why wouldn't you be? But we encourage you to think about it. We will probably also have some kind of in-person gathering for the fellows at some point. Again, we're still working out the details, but the program is up and running with those 3 schools. There's information on it and how to apply. If these guys seem interesting to work with, we encourage you to apply for the FJP Fellows Program and spend a summer and into next year working with us on criminal justice reform issues.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come up here and speak about your work and the students. This is a place where there are a lot of people come and who are inspiring, but I will say I have never been more inspired over an hour and a half than by what you all have talked about. I had that sort of tingly feeling in the back of my neck about a dozen times as you all were speaking. You do amazing work. You're enormously inspirational, and I say that for myself, but I think I'm speaking for many of the students here. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.